Bush was born on June 12, 1924, in Milton, Massachusetts, just south of Boston. He was a decorated U.S. Navy pilot who flew torpedo bombers and survived being shot down during World War II. He met Barbara Pierce at a Christmas dance when they were just teenagers. They got married in 1945 when he was home on leave from the war. He later graduated from Yale University, and then with Barbara, they moved to Texas to work in the oil business, and that is where he eventually got into politics. He became a congressman and ran for president in 1980. He lost the Republican nomination to Ronald Reagan, but became his vice president, and finally, 8 years later, took the oath of office himself as commander-in-chief. On his watch, a lot of foreign policy got done. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, President Bush led an international coalition that defeated the Iraqi forces. He also started the Points of Light Foundation to promote community service. After leaving the White House, former First Lady Barbara Bush started her own charity to help more people learn to read. She was quite an advocate for literacy and was tireless about it. They were married 73 years, longer than any other first couple in U.S. history. They had 6 children, including a daughter who died of leukemia when she was just 3. They've been very open and talked about how difficult a time that was for them. Their eldest son, of course, George W. Bush, became the 43rd president of the United States. They had 17 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. After Barbara Bush died, her husband said she did not want it to go on. He said at the time, quote, "So cross the Bushes off your list." Together again. George H.W. Bush, the 41st president of the United States, dead tonight at 94. Brett Baer looks back at the life of this American hero.
For a new breeze is blowing, and a world refreshed by freedom seems reborn. For in man's heart, if not in fact, the day of the dictator is over.
George Bush's hardest task as president was giving the green light for Operation Desert Storm. But he is credited with rescuing the tiny, oil-rich nation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's million-man army of Iraq. Before George Herbert Walker Bush took his first step into the White House, he learned to walk in Kennebunkport, Maine. Born June 12, 1924, in the town of Milton, Massachusetts, to a family already deeply involved in public service, he was the second of 5 children to Dorothy and Senator Prescott Bush. With high school behind him, George was accepted at Yale University, but put his education on hold. The start of the Second World War beckoned him to serve his country instead. In 1942, George Bush celebrated his 18th birthday by enlisting in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Within a year, he was Ensign Bush, the youngest fighter pilot in the Navy. Taking part in 58 combat missions in the Pacific Theater, Bush was flying his plane on a special bombing mission over China when he was shot down by the Japanese and was forced to bail out at sea. He survived, though his crew did not.
I'm floating around in this raft, paddling, and then all of a sudden saw this conning tower come up and saw the submarine surface.
With the end of the war in sight, Bush set his sights on Barbara Pierce. The two wed in 1945, while Bush was still in the Navy. They would have 6 children, including our 43rd president, George W. Bush, and popular Florida Governor Jeb. Bush left the Navy and graduated from Yale before he and Barbara moved to Texas to find his dreams on an oil field. By the age of 30, he was co-founder and president of Zapata Offshore, which pioneered experimental drilling equipment. But just like his father, Bush was attracted to public service and attended the annual Memorial Day Parade. He wrote in a tweet, he is, quote, forever grateful not only to those patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation, but also the Gold Star families whose heritage is imbued with their honor and heroism. Known for his maturity and straightforward approach, George H.W. Bush called this country to be better, in hopes of inspiring the people to be great.
I think historians are going to say it. And that's all right for me. I'm not in any rush. Be in heaven, look down, and let him make that determination.
We also have Brett Baer with us tonight, anchor of Special Report and also our chief political anchor on the phone with us tonight. Brett, and as I look at that piece, I'm overwhelmed when I think about, and I wonder your impressions too, one of the first and foremost things I always thought about with Bush 41 was his humility, especially given all he accomplished.
Think about how many things President H.W. Bush accomplished. He was a Navy pilot, a World War II vet, a congressman, a UN ambassador, an envoy, a CIA director, a vice president, a president, obviously a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather. In the wake of all of those things, he was one of the most humble people you'd ever meet. And most people would tell you in interacting with President Bush, he would be asking about you. Mm-hmm. He would be asking about how you were. There is no more figure in American history that I think bridges the gap between someone like President Reagan, who is largely credited for bringing down communism, but yet President George H.W. Bush is the person where the wall actually falls down during his presidency. And you think back on history at these moments, President H.W. Bush is going to be someone who history probably smiles on quite a bit.
Absolutely, Brett. And somebody who, when I think about the old-fashioned notion of somebody really wanting to serve their country, we talk about his Navy service and all the other many posts that don't get as much attention because he ended up being our 41st president. He really was somebody who wanted to sort of keep his nose down. It wasn't about scoring bragging points or getting attention. He really did have that from the gut. Your country is important. You do service, and you do it quietly and humbly, but you work hard at it.
And he instilled that in his family. I mean, this is one of the most prolific political families we've ever seen in U.S. history. This statement from his son, President George W. Bush, is quite something. Where he says, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro, and I are saddened to announce that after 94 remarkable years, our dear dad has died. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. The entire Bush family deeply grateful for 41's life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens. This is the statement from his son, President 43. I think what you really saw was in the funeral of Barbara Bush in April, something that he was saying goodbye, and a lot of people who were close to President H.W. Bush said they thought it was just a matter of time because of their relationship was so close that it was tough to see how he was going to, in his current state, last very long. But he did. And he was on Twitter. He was putting out statements. And I think tonight is something that this family was waiting for, but one that obviously they're saddened for. Absolutely.
Brett, thank you so much. Our coverage continues now on Fox News Channel, on cable and satellite. We're going to take you back to regular programming on this Fox station. I'm Shannon Bream for Fox News in New York. We now have with us on the phone as well Chris Wallace, the anchor of Fox News Sunday, who has spent many hours, many months and years covering the Bush family and President Bush 41 in particular. Chris, your reaction to the news tonight and your memories?
Well, you know, there's an old thing we used to say about baseball players. We used to say that Ted Williams was the greatest living a baseball player, and I have felt for some time that George H.W. Bush was the greatest living American, and we have lost him tonight. I was just watching Brett's wonderful obituary, and the thing that is so extraordinary about it, one is how many things he did, as Brett pointed out. Each chapter could have been a lifetime, but it was one chapter after another. And the thing that also really impressed me about George Bush's life is that he could have led a much easier life. He was the son of a very wealthy establishment family in Greenwich, Connecticut, and he's at Yale University, and he basically lies about his age so he can get into the Navy. And as Brett pointed out, he was the youngest Navy pilot, volunteer for his country, fly in the Pacific, get shot down, ends up going back to Yale. And then after he graduates, and again, his wife, Barbara, I'm looking at the pictures of the two of them together, was also from a very wealthy family in Connecticut, the Pierce family, and they could have had a very easy, cosseted life, living in New England, part of the establishment. Bush's father, Preston Bush, was a United States Senator. But no, he leaves, goes to a part of the country he really doesn't know at all, Texas, and becomes an oil man. And again, takes the hard road, not the easy road, and to make a name and a life for himself. And that was George H.W. Bush. One of the other things I think you need to point out, yes, he was a very gentleman. Yes, he was an extremely polished and great fun to be around. He was fiercely competitive, whether it was politics, whether it was a horseshoe game and the pitch he set up in back of the White House. He was a fighter. And when he lost to Bill Clinton in 1992, and of course this is just a year after he had presided over the enormous victory in the Gulf War over Saddam Hussein, so it was a huge disappointment. He was very hurt by it, but he picked himself up and led another full life after that.
He did. And Chris, we talk about the family, the closeness that they had, along with the competitiveness, but really the marriage between him and Barbara Bush, 73 years. It was the longest of any first couple in our country's history. And it was really unique. I mean, they were equals. She was not your traditional first lady in a lot of ways. And they always seemed to be having a great time together, to not only be spouses, but really be close friends and partners, and really each other's biggest cheerleaders.
Absolutely. And she was known as the Silver Fox. She had a tart tongue to a certain degree. She was the leader of the family because he was off pursuing his various adventures, whether it was in China or the CIA or a congressman or an oil man or whatever. And she was really the one, and he admitted it, who brought up the family. And they suffered a terrible loss. Their oldest child, Robin, a little girl, died of leukemia. And, you see these pictures here of Barbara Bush. Her hair turned white at a very young age because this was just a terrible shock to them, the loss of their daughter. But they pulled themselves together, and you're right, they were very good friends. She knew how to deliver a zinger, and sometimes it was at her husband's expense, and nobody laughed more at it than he did, and it probably kept him grounded over the years.
Yeah, and definitely in defense of her family when it was necessary. We saw that side of her as well. And he was very, very supportive of her literacy efforts. I mean, something that she spent decades doing and became so well known for. And he often praised her for what she had accomplished and what she was doing after they left office, just as much as anything he'd ever done.
Yeah, and they both had this tremendous sense of people who have had the advantages that they have in life that you give back. She had her literacy program. He had his 1,000 points of light. And I remember when it first came out, when he was running for president in 1988, nobody quite knew what it meant. But what it meant was the idea that individuals could do acts of kindness, acts of generosity, give to other people, and really contribute to people's lives. And she was a literacy program. Interestingly, for a man who accomplished so much, there were two words that he hated. One was legacy. if you asked him, and I had the great good fortune to interview him as a vice president, as a presidential candidate in 1980 when he lost to Ronald Reagan as a president, and then as a former president. If you asked him about legacy, he didn't want to play on that. It was, the L word, he would call it, and he'd say, the historians will decide that. I don't want to sit there and psychoanalyze and talk about what my legacy is. And the other word he didn't like very much was dynasty. And when you think about it, I mean, there were a lot of great American families, but there were two families that had two presidents in them, a father and a son, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush 43. And he didn't like that idea of dynasty either. He said, yes, we taught our children the idea of public service, but it wasn't necessarily to be in political service. There were all kinds of ways to serve, and didn't particularly like the idea of the Bush dynasty, although, of course, there was a Bush dynasty.
Yeah, and as we talked about tonight, of course, when you become president, everything else on your resume sort of pales in comparison. But the fact that he was a very important envoy to China, that he headed up the CIA, I mean, he had such a varied background and so many things that he planted seeds that sprouted roots and grew into things down the line. When we think about major foreign policy accomplishments, I mean, that wasn't something new to him as vice president or president, Chris.
No, that's exactly right. Although, it's interesting. Brett talked about the fact that he was there when the wall fell, and that in 1989, and it was very interesting. I had the chance to interview him at the Bush Library, which is in College Station, part of the campus of Texas A&M. And one of the things that he talked about there was that this is November of 1989, and the wall fell, and there was a lot of push from some of his advisors. This is obviously a huge geopolitical victory. It was the end of the Cold War, for him to kind of puff up and say this is a great American victory. And he went against a lot of his advisors, and he said, no, we're not going to do that, because it's going to make, if we do that, it will come at the expense of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union still. And he said it will come at his expense, and it will make him harder to do his job. And what we want is not a victory dance as much as we want stability. And, how many politicians would sit there and not take the easy, obvious applause that he was going to get, but instead say, let's play this under the radar a bit so that we can make life easier for Mikhail Gorbachev, which will make it easier for him to withdraw and to keep his country together.
Chris Wallace, anchor of Fox News Sunday. If you will come back as we continue coverage, we want to turn now to Karl Rove, who obviously a lot of folks remember him for his work within the Bush 43 White House. But Karl, maybe a lot of folks don't know that you were actually part of the George H.W. Bush presidential campaigns, and the first one, which he ran unsuccessfully in 1980. It was hard fought. He didn't give up. He came back, but quite a momentous occasion.
Yes, it was. I'd actually gone to work for him when I was 22 years old, and he was chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1973 and 1974. And then he went off to China, and then came back to the CIA, and then began thinking in 1977 about running for president. And I went to work for him. I was 26 years old, and spent most of 1977 and 1978 traveling with him as he went around the country laying the foundation for his presidential campaign. It was about 18 most extraordinary months of my life.
I mean, we look at him when we talk about what a statesman, what a gentleman he was, even in defeat, and certainly in victory as well. But he'd been through campaigns that were not successful before. How tough was that one?
Well, in a way it was tough, and in a way it wasn't. It was tough in that he lost the nomination, but Ronald Reagan wisely asked him to be his running mate in order to unite the party. And so defeat turned into partial victory. He and Reagan had a close relationship. And but, the thing about George H.W. Bush that people need to remember is this is a man of enormous courage who was fearless. He entered the U.S. Navy at the age of 18 as a combat pilot, the youngest Navy combat pilot in World War II, shot down. When he went after the war, he went to Yale, rushed through Yale in 3 years, started a family. But rather than joining his father at Brown Brothers Harriman in New York, a prestigious financial firm, instead he struck out for the oil patch, and for living first in Bakersfield, California, and then Odessa, and then Midland, Texas, learning the oil business from the ground up, selling tools, learning the oil patch from the bottom up, because he wanted to start his own enterprise, and started an oil company, independent oil company, named after a character he saw in a movie, Viva Zapata, and he named his Zapata Oil Company and made it. In a way, think about that. He left the comfort of the East in order to strike out for what in the early 50s was the rough frontier of the oil patch, because he wanted to build something of his own. And when he ran for office in Texas, I mean, literally they hunted Republicans with dogs when he ran for the U.S. Senate. When he was elected to Congress, I think he was one of 2 Republican members of the Congress from Texas. And even then, he demonstrated enormous courage. In 1966, I think it was, the Open Housing Act, very unpopular in the South, but the idea of every person, regardless of their race or their color or their background, having a right to get a home and to rent an apartment, regardless of where they came from and who they were, he voted for it and went back home and faced the voters and explained why he had taken this very unpopular vote, because it was the right thing to do. And that was one of the great experiences of working for him over the years, was seeing what enormous character he had. He was a decent, humble man, but he had character. He was strong, and it really was remarkable. He is a member of the greatest generation, and there's a reason that we call him that, not just because they saved the world, and they did, but also because they had the virtues and the values that really are timeless. And this was an extraordinary individual who served our country with such dignity and strength and conviction and effectiveness.
Yeah, and in so many different ways, Carl. I mean, you talk about his bravery in business and politics and the military and service. What do you think drove him? I mean, as somebody who spent all that time with him, crisscrossing the country, talking to people about why they should vote for him to become president, what was the driving force in all of those things that gave him such courage and made him such a risk taker?
Well, first of all, he loved America. He had a deep patriotism, not the patriotism that sometimes you see where people are shouting at the top of their lungs, but a recognition that this was a great country that had done so much for its people, and that so much more could be done. I mean, he believed in the American dream. He believed in the American experiment. He believed that America was a country that was a great country and capable of being even greater. And he felt an obligation to serve. It sounds old-fashioned. People used to talk about noblesse oblige, but he came from a family of wealth and privilege, and yet he was one of the most down-to-earth people, one of the most humble people. One of the things that I learned from him was that every person deserved respect. That we'd be someplace, and I remember once we went to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and when he was a young Navy aviator and he was training, one of his classmates had been a Pillsbury. And when the senior Mr. Pillsbury, who was running this giant company, this giant food and agriculture company, heard that this young pilot was going to be landing at the airport, who'd been his son's classmate, he went out and met him. And I remember President Bush talking to me about how moved he was that this man took such time out of his schedule to come and meet this young pilot and say hello to him and tell him, he appreciated his service to the country. And I thought that was, there's the humility of the man. And yet everybody he met, and I saw this every day that we were on the road, if you were the person who was serving him a cup of coffee at the cafe, or if you were the CEO of a major company who was talking about supporting him for president, he treated everybody with equal respect and dignity. And everybody in his eyes was a child of God. And it's rare in politics that you see somebody who can be so well grounded that doing all of the things that he did and remained such a decent and honorable and good person. And, you know, nobody came to the presidency with more experience. You know, U.S. congressman, chairman of his party, ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to China in the early days of our relationship there, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president of the United States for 8 years. And yet he was the same person to his friends and associates, the people who'd known him for a long time, that they had known when he was making a break, you know, trying to make a break in the oil patch, or moving to Houston and helping form the Republican Party there. I mean, there's a consistency to his life that is remarkable, because it represents the highest values to which we all ought to aspire.
And Carl, I want to read some of the statements that are coming in from family and friends tonight. The statement by President George W. Bush on the death of his father. President George H.W. Bush, he says, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro, and I are saddened to announce that after 94 remarkable years, our dear dad has died. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. The entire Bush family is deeply grateful for 41's life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens. And also from former Secretary of State James Baker III. He was the former White House Chief of Staff under President George H.W. Bush. He says the legacy of George H.W. Bush will be forever etched in the history of America and the world. It is a lifelong record of selfless, patriotic service to our nation. He was the youngest Navy pilot in World War II, a Texas congressman, UN ambassador, America's first envoy to China, CIA director, vice president, and president. In each and every one of these positions, he led with strength, integrity, compassion, and humility, characteristics that define a truly great man and effective leader with a singularly unique consistency. He always demonstrated these traits, whether on the global stage or interacting with people in his everyday life. His passion was a deep love of family and our country. It was my pleasure and great joy to have had him as my special friend for more than 60 years. Susan joins me in grieving the passing of our dear friend and sending the entire Bush family our deepest love and condolences. Karl Rove stays on the line with us. Bret Baier is back as well. Bret, I want to bring you back in here because as we talk about this over and over again, this enormous resume that it really would be hard for anyone to match in diversity and commitment to this country. There's such a consistency in people talking about the personal side of how much he was loved and respected and how he treated everybody the same. When we think about the fun side of him, too, he's quite a jokester. I mean, he marked several of his recent birthdays by skydiving. Bret, he was a thrill seeker to the end, it seems like.
That's right. You know, listen, we're at the Reagan Library, Shannon, and we're getting ready for the Reagan Defense Forum this weekend. It's really fitting that we're here because obviously President Bush was President Reagan's vice president, but he was also such an integral part of all of those years that really changed the trajectory of the entire country. As we look behind me, the Air Force One that President Reagan took around the world, you think about all of the things that not only President Reagan but President Bush did to change the dynamic of the U.S. presence in the world and where that stands today. In large part because of the actions of both of those administrations. Just moments ago, Dan Quayle, President Bush's vice president, released a statement saying, as so many Americans did, I had true affection for the man, George Bush. He was a completely genuine, decent, and honorable person. What's more, he went into and out of the office as absolutely the same man. I think that exemplifies his character. I've often told my children, if you want a role model in life, look to President George Herbert Walker Bush. The world mourns the loss of a great American, but it also celebrates a life well lived. And I think, Shannon, you know, when Barbara Bush passed in April, there was a sense that everyone was getting ready for President H.W. Bush to pass as well. And over this time, people have come to think about how they're going to mourn this man who really did change our country. And I think there will be a lot of reflections about how he was not only as a man, but as a president of these United States.
Brett, if you'll stand by, I want to bring back in Karl Rove for a final thought, too, as we are summarizing the life. And even though Chris Wallace said he didn't love the word legacy, I mean, he undoubtedly leaves one behind, Karl, and it is of the highest caliber.
It really is. I mean, think about it. Ronald Reagan, and with his Vice President George Bush and an incredible administration, won the Cold War. And the Soviet Union ended on the watch of George H.W. Bush, and it required deft diplomacy in order to make certain that that moment came, not as one of exaltation of the United States bragging about its victory over Russia, but instead a quiet diplomacy that allowed Russia to begin to move in a democratic direction and for the world to be safe and to bring to reduce the nuclear armaments, to end the missiles that were aimed at the U.S. and Kazakhstan and elsewhere, and bring that nuclear material out. And then on the watch too, the invasion of Kuwait, and the leadership, the strong and effective leadership to bring the world together and to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. But the man, Brett was right. This is a man of enormous character, and we made a long list of public accomplishments. We could keep going. I mean, remember, this was the captain of the NCAA National College Baseball Champion. One of the things that he had in his office at the Republican National Committee was a picture of him and Babe Ruth. It was one of his treasured possessions. And he had a wonderful sense of humor. I think that's why he and Mr. Baker, Jim Baker, who was my boss back when I worked for him in 1977 and 78, the two of them told each other jokes, some of the worst jokes you've ever heard in your life. You laughed at the fact that you were laughing at them. And I went to say goodbye to him a couple weeks before the election. And the body was failing, but the mind was there, and the sense of humor was there, and the love of his country was there. We talked about
Today we will formally declare
what was going on, but he would come. He would out of nowhere. He would deliver a very funny line because he just had a wonderful sense of humor. But I'm going to miss him a lot. I know everybody who knew him, everybody who considered him a friend or a mentor or a boss is going to is tonight grieving over the loss of a great man.
Mm-hmm. Karl Rove, thank you so much. I mean, anybody who ever met him, you knew that he always had a real twinkle in his eye. Dana Perino is with us on the phone as well. I want to bring Dana in. And Dana, I'm looking at a statement that we've now gotten from former President Barack Obama, former First Lady Michelle Obama, talking about him. It is lengthy and it is glowing. And they talk about America's lost a patriot and humble servant in George Herbert Walker Bush. While our hearts are heavy today, they're also filled with gratitude. They talk about all that he did, saying it's a legacy of service that could never be matched, although he'd want all of us to try. Dana?
Thank you for having me, Shannon. Yes, I think that we will now see a national bipartisan mourning for President George H.W. Bush, affectionately known as 41. I certainly agree with everything that Karl said. It was such an honor and privilege to know him, to have worked for his son. Certainly, he set an example for all of us. People have talked about tonight on your air, Shannon, of his character. I also wanted to mention a couple of other things. He taught us important life lessons and how to live a life. This is a man who loved life, and he went through so much. As Karl mentioned, a college baseball player, a fighter pilot, and then a husband and a father, a businessman, and becomes a congressman, ambassador. The CIA, people often forget he was head of the CIA, vice president, but most important to him was being a father and a grandfather, and then a great-grandfather, of course. He truly was 1,000 points of light, which was his legacy of giving that was so important to him. He taught us, I think, to live with gratitude and with that grace and the dignity, but also just this unbelievable modesty that sometimes frustrated his communications handlers because he would never, ever brag about himself, and that makes it sometimes hard when you're running for office trying to convince people that you're the best one for the job. I also picked up a couple of weeks ago the book that 43, George W. Bush, wrote about his father. It's called 41, A Portrait of My Father. And I think, upon learning this news tonight, as sad as it is, of course, one of the things I remembered from that book, and I just looked it back up, is that you'll remember that President Bush and Barbara Bush lost their daughter Robin to leukemia when she was only 4 years old. And this was a heartbreak that nearly broke them. And Barbara Bush talked about it in the aftermath in later years. And apparently, as 43 writes, is that as 41 contemplated his own mortality, he recently asked his minister whether he'd meet Robin in heaven and if she would look like a child or look like an adult. And they said, that's one of the great mysteries. And the first thing I thought of is, well, now he knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so many references tonight, the fact that they're back together, he and his wife and the precious daughter that they lost, and they talked about the great anguish and the suffering that they went through, and now together again tonight. Dana, if you'll stick around, I want to bring Brett back in with more of the statement that we have from former President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama. They wrap up their statement, Brett, saying this: what a testament to the qualities that make this country great. Service to others, commitment to leaving behind something better, sacrifice in the name of lifting this country closer to its founding ideals. Our thoughts are with the entire Bush family tonight and all who were inspired by George and Barbara's example. And Brett, we know that's been a lot of people across the partisan aisle.
Shannon, if there was a president who was more bipartisan, there really weren't many of them. Eisenhower was one of them. Clearly, Reagan was one of them with his relationship with Tip O'Neill. But George H.W. Bush was one of them as well, and really wanted to reach across the aisle in numerous ways, but especially when he launched the invasion of Iraq to take down Saddam Hussein and to really liberate the Kuwaitis. Didn't end up taking down Saddam Hussein in that effort, and was criticized at some point for not going further at that point. But the reason he didn't is because he didn't have the coalition's backing at that point. He actually, for launching the war to liberate Kuwait, had the biggest international coalition of any president that has ever assembled a coalition. One of the things about George H.W. Bush is that he always reached out across the aisle. He established a really strong relationship with Bill Clinton. In their afterlife, as you've talked about before, they had, after the presidency, a life of raising money for charity, one in which they established a very close relationship. But President H.W. Bush will go down as somebody who was one of these presidents who was not tremendously ideological. He was about getting stuff done. And I think history, John Meacham wrote a large book about President Bush's life. And I think you look at that and the span of all the things that happened, there will be a lot of things remembered under 1924 to 2018.
Yeah, and enormous foreign policy achievements that when people really look back at his accomplishments as president and coming through the Reagan years as vice president as well, I mean, those are notable. But so many things domestically, too, that he had a hand in making sure happened. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was a landmark piece of legislation. As somebody who used to practice labor and employment law, I handled many cases under the ADA, and how important it was to make a way for people to have a place in the workplace and in society, despite any physical challenge that they may have. So there's a lot that happened domestically as well, even though he had just one term as the head of the White House, Brett, as Commander-in-Chief.
Yeah, think how challenging that was, though, as I'm standing here in the Reagan Presidential Library, for a vice president to follow one of the most popular presidents in President Reagan. Obviously, in his second term, President Reagan's approval ratings went down a bit. But here is a vice president who steps into the role of someone who's taking over for this larger-than-life figure. Now, President Reagan fought communism more than any other president, perhaps. The Berlin Wall goes down under George H.W. Bush. It happens, and I researched this and wrote about it, and at the time, Brent Scowcroft and Marlin Fitzwater, his press secretary, run into the Oval Office and say, "Do you want to make a statement?" And George H.W. Bush says, "No, I don't." And they say, "Why? You have to make a statement. It's happening. It's happening live." And he says, "I really don't want to dance on the top of the Berlin Wall coming down. I want to establish my own relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. I want to establish it in a way that respects him and doesn't tap dance on this moment." And I think that moment, more than any other, when the Berlin Wall comes down and George H.W. Bush does not take that moment to say, "See, we won," says more about the man and how he dealt with things than many other things.
Yeah, and if you, and I know that you, I'm sure undoubtedly have had the chance, but others out there watching, if you have a chance to go to his presidential library, they're always such interesting places, no matter whom the president was. But when you walk through there and you read about his Navy service and the story about him being shot down, you talk through and walk through each chapter of his life. It is so varied, and we think about lighthearted moments with him too. I mean, we know he didn't like broccoli. You know, he loved his crazy socks. I mean, he was quite a character aside from being a very serious policy wonk and getting serious things done. We know that he, you know, was awarded numerous medals during his Navy service, and the Medal of Freedom by President Obama. But as we keep going back to this theme of how important family was to him, we think about the summer just a few weeks ago, one of his granddaughters, Barbara Bush, got married and took that wedding to Kennebunkport and said that it was so important that they wanted him to be a part of it. She'd lost her grandmother, obviously, earlier in the year, and the family really wanted to be together and celebrate that together. And they're rejoicing that they had those moments together to celebrate another happy time before he headed back to Texas, whereas we talked about earlier, his spokesman said he was looking forward to getting back to Texas because he wanted some good Tex-Mex down there. He was a character.
He was a total character. And family was so important, Shannon, to President Bush. You know, I had the privilege of being invited to a golf tournament out in Maine at Kennebunkport and played alongside with a bunch of different people with President George W. Bush. And at one point, President George H.W. Bush arrived, and he was in a golf cart with Barbara Bush at that time. And you just saw the love between the two of them, even at that advanced stage where they were just caring for each other. It was actually the same day in that obit piece where the eclipse happened, and they had that picture with the sunglasses that you see. I think what was most striking to me was to read back about the love letters and the exchanges between President Bush and Barbara Bush, and then that stark image at Barbara Bush's funeral in April where he is sitting there in a wheelchair with Doro Bush behind him, and then the casket in front of them in that church. And there it is, that moment where he is saying goodbye to the love of his life. And I think Barbara Bush's funeral actually was a cathartic moment for the country, in which you saw people of both sides reacting to this family that had really changed the country's life. And I think you're going to see that over the next couple of days and perhaps the next week as the country says goodbye to the 41st President of the United States. And there will be a lot of people from both sides who have a lot of things to say about this president.
Absolutely. And Dana Perino is still with us on the phone as well. And Dana, we talk about this tender relationship that he had with his wife and with his family, but he really was somebody that it didn't matter if you were a head of state or somebody who happened to be on a garden tour through the White House. I mean, he really did make people feel like he genuinely cared about who they were, where they were from, and really just had that way about him that he valued people at every level, regardless of who they were.
That's another one of the great lessons that he taught us. In June of this year, 2018, Peter and I had a chance to go to Maine and visit with him. And he was quite sleepy that day, or dozy, I should say, relaxing. He had his head back, and he wanted to hold on to my hand as I talked to him and told him some stories. And I kept wanting to leave him be and give him some time to rest. And so I would make to leave, and maybe I'd stand up a bit, and he would squeeze my hand so hard and say, no, stay. And that, of course, you're right. He had a way of making me feel special. I'm sure he did that with everyone that came through. To Brett's point just a moment ago about how he was perceived in the presidency and the post-presidency, I remember speaking to Marlon Fitzwater, who was, of course, press secretary to Ronald Reagan and then for George H.W. Bush. And he said that when they left the White House in January of 1993, he said, we really had our heads hung low. And partly it was because he thought no one will ever know or how great a man 41 was. And he said, just look at what's happened. He is now one of the most revered people in modern history, for sure. And there's a special also relationship, of course, in history that John Adams and John Quincy Adams, of course, were the first father and son to serve as president. And when 43 was asked to write the book about 41, one of the things he asked his dad was, how did you find the strength to conduct yourself with such grace and dignity? And 41 said, I had no choice. And that is because he chose to live not bitterly, which is, again, why I think you see this tremendous outpouring. And a very sad day. I see, you're showing the pictures of him on his parachute jump. He just loved life and wanted to experience all of it.
He absolutely did. And Brett, we're looking back at some of his quotes over the years. He was pithy at times and pointed, not afraid to make fun of himself or other people, but something very pointed he said, speaking to a joint session of Congress in 1991, he said this, he says, if anyone tells you that America's best days are behind her, they're looking the wrong way. But he was always so hopeful and optimistic and always betting on this country.
Always, and I love the picture of President Bush and Barbara Bush doing the coin toss at the Super Bowl. That was a moment, and the country rallies around those kinds of moments. This was a family, and is a family, frankly, that has been with a lot of generations of America. And we just identify with them because they've been the leaders of this country. Barbara Bush famously once said, it's enough Bushes, even as Jeb Bush was running for president, and she later amended that. But she and George H.W. Bush were seminal figures in this country, and I think that you're going to see over the next few days a lot of outpouring from around the world. One thing to say about, as I'm standing here at the Reagan Library, is that President Reagan really valued George H.W. Bush and his consult, his advice, and especially as it became clear that he was heir apparent, if you will, to win the presidency. I think there was a real mutual admiration. It developed over time. Clearly, they were adversaries politically prior to Reagan's winning the White House. But once in the White House, they were partners. And it became very clear at the end of the Reagan administration how much that became to be true.
Yeah, and Brett, another one of the funnier nuggets that we've dug up among his former quotes, one of them he said, I'm conservative, but I'm not a nut about it. And we remember back and the fact that he wanted very much to encourage this idea of compassionate conservatism, of having, a heart for people who were poor and disadvantaged. I talked about earlier about how he was instrumental in signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, he definitely wanted to bring a softer side to politics and to the game that a lot of people think is very ugly. He very much wanted to be a statesman and to find common ground. You talked about that, just about how bipartisan he could be in reaching across the aisle and truly trying to find solutions and not, being a flamethrower. In scoring political points, he seemed genuinely about finding solutions, whether they were domestic or international.
Right, and that's the advice he gave his son, President George W. Bush, 43. He said, figure out a way to find people who can find common ground and get things done. I just want to read briefly from, as you look at that picture of George H.W. Bush looking at Barbara Bush's casket, historian John Meacham, in that eulogy to Barbara Pierce Bush, calling her the greatest, First Lady of the greatest generation. From the White House to Camp David to Walker's Point, in hours of war and of peace, of tumult and of calm, the Bushes governed with congeniality, with civility, and with grace. Instinctively generous, Barbara and George Bush put country above party, the common good above political gain, and service to others above the settling of scores. There is a hunger, I think, Shannon, for that, for civility, for decorum, for that President George H.W. Bush exuded. This is not to speak ill of either party or how things are operating or any specific leader. This is